First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for creating this opportunity to talk about the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam and the history and the politics surrounding this national project. So I start by thanking all the organizers of this conference, and particularly the Ethiopian Waterworks group. The paper that I'm given is called the Geopolitics of the GERD, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and the forces shaping the future of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. So generally, the thrust of my presentation would be a discussion about the history and politics that's affecting Ethiopia in particular, but also the Horn of Africa in general, in connection with the construction of the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the implication of this national project in the region, and particularly in the Nile Basin region. So I will focus on specific issues that are relevant to the discussion about geopolitics in the Horn of Africa, with a specific emphasis on Ethiopia. The Nile River, which is known as Abai in the Ethiopian case, has captured the imagination of Ethiopians and people of the Nile Basin region for centuries. We know that areas, countries like Egypt and the birth of the Egyptian civilization, it was deeply connected to the Nile River. And some 2,500 years ago, around the 5th century BCE, before the Common Era, the Greek historian talked about Egypt, and the description that he provided about Egypt is still true. And he said Egypt is a gift of the Nile. So it is practically impossible to think about Egypt and Egyptian civilization without the Nile River. But at the same time, the Nile River is also is an important part of Ethiopia's national psyche. It defined the nature of Ethiopian history, the nature of Ethiopia's relations with the region and with the world. So for the region in general, but specifically for the three countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan, the Nile River has occupied a very critical, a very strategic place, both in the past and in the present. I think there are two issues that we can talk about when it comes to the Nile River and the region, the Nile Basin region. Historically, but also in the present. One is there is one constant pattern in the history of the Nile River and in the history of the relations between countries surrounding the Nile River. And what that one is the history of interdependence, a history of interdependence among countries in the Nile River Basin, particularly the three countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan. And this history of interdependence and connectedness has defined the history of the region and the history of foreign relations in the Nile Basin region. And my emphasis is on the three countries, which are critical to any discussion about the Nile River in the past and in the present. The two downstream countries, Egypt and the Sudan, and one upstream country here, Ethiopia, which is the source of almost 86% of the waters of the Nile River. So that's history. And this history of connectedness and interdependence has continued to define the relations to the present. Although there are significant disruptions and significant challenges in this history of interdependence and connections. But then there is also another aspect in the history of the Nile River region, and that is a history of profound anxiety, of profound distrust between countries that depend on the river, particularly Egypt on the one end, and then Ethiopia on the other end. So we have this history, a very complicated history of interdependence on the one end, and competition on the one end, and cooperation, on the one end, and then you have a history of mistrust and a history of confrontation, that eventually led to military clashes between Ethiopia and Egypt in the 1880s. So I can divide this history, this very fascinating history of the Nile Basin region into two. One, a very fascinating, very complicated, very troubled past, a past which is poisoned by the experience of European colonialism, particularly British colonialism, a European colonial experience that introduced a very new element in the relation among these African countries. And that is a new paradigm which we might characterize as a zero-sum game, a win-lose paradigm in which the benefit of one country or one part of the region comes at the expense of another country. In this particular case, the policy, this paradigm, the zero-sum game politics around the Nile River, introduced during the 19th century, especially during the period of British colonialism in Egypt, in the Sudan, it was intended to benefit Egypt, but at the expense of Ethiopia. And we have seen this history of exclusionary control, exclusionary dominance, or a desire to dominate the Nile River, complicated the relationship between Ethiopia on the one end and the countries of Egypt and the Sudan on the other end. And we've seen these even before the arrival of the British. During the period of the Egyptian leaders like Muhammad Ali in the 1840s, and then Karim Ismail Pasha in the 1870s. And later on in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, the early 20th century, or the first part of the 20th century, we have seen a continuation of this difficult, this monopolistic, this win-lose kind of relationship until into the 20th century, with the signing of treaties in 1902, for instance, and then in 1929, and then 1959. And all these three treaties and the violent military expansion by the Egyptians in the 1820s, in the 1830s, 40s, and the 1870s, and all were geared towards one objective, and that is to ensure the uninterrupted flow of the waters of the Nile from upstream countries, and most importantly Ethiopia, to downstream countries, the Sudan and Egypt, which were under British colonial control until the first half of the 20th century. So this kind of unequal relationship unequal relationship was unsustainable, and was always resisted by upstream countries, particularly Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in the forefront of resisting, challenging this monopolistic control, monopolistic utilization of the waters of the Nile, first by the Egyptians and then by the British. So there is that history, that poisoned, that troubled past around the Nile River. But then comes the independence, the period of independence in the 1950s, in the 1960s, where colonialism, European and specifically British colonialism, came to an end. And this winning of independence, created a new political dispensation in the Nile Basin region. And this new political dispensation is represented by resistance, successful resistance on the part of upstream countries, countries that are the source of the waters of the Nile River, particularly Ethiopia, but other countries like Tanzania or Kenya, Uganda, to the status quo. So they presented a profound resistance, legal, political resistance to the status quo, and specifically to the colonial treaties that the British, that the Egyptians and the Sudanese wanted to perpetuate in the post-independence period, in the period after the end of colonialism. In fact, there is this doctrine which is called the Nyerere doctrine, the doctrine which is about a decision, a determination on the part of upstream countries, beginning with Tanzania, but adopted later on by countries like Kenya and Uganda, that the colonial treaties signed over the Nile waters without the participation of upstream countries are not binding. They are not binding, they are not legally defensible, so they are not acceptable. So they are rejected. And this resistance, this successful resistance, which is a resistance on both legal, political terms, but also on moral grounds. Moral grounds meaning the very unequal nature of the relationship between downstream and upstream countries when it comes to the Nile waters. It created this, or let's say strengthened this anxiety, this imagined fear on the part of the downstream countries, particularly Egypt. And that fear is a fear that these newly independent countries, like Tanzania or Kenya, Uganda, and then Ethiopia, which is a country that did not have any colonial experience, never colonized, these new independent countries and their new demand for a reasonable, equitable share to the Nile waters represented an existential threat to Egypt. So this is the conception, a misguided, a wrong perception on the part of the leadership, the political leadership in Egypt and the Sudan, that the demands by countries like Ethiopia or other riparian countries presented a profound threat to Egypt, to the very survival of Egypt, to the very existence of Egypt. So there is this notion of insecurity that came to characterize Egyptian relation with upstream countries, particularly Ethiopia. So what we see in the post-independence period, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, is a deliberate attempt by the downstream countries led by Egypt and to some extent the Sudan, to undermine the position of upstream countries, particularly Ethiopia. I think there are two aspects of what I would call Egypt's southern policy. A southern policy which had antecedents in the 19th century Egyptian policy towards the south, towards Ethiopia in particular, and which continued throughout the 20th century, even after independence in the 1950s and the 60s. So let's call this Egypt's southern policy, a new redefinition of Egypt's southern policy in the 20th century, in the post-colonial period. And one element of this Egypt's southern policy is an attempt to undermine Ethiopia's development efforts, particularly by influencing powerful countries and institutions like the World Bank not to provide funding in support of Ethiopia's development projects, including the construction of dams on the Nile River. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is to use its political clout in Africa and beyond Africa, outside of Africa, to destabilize these upstream countries, but with a particular focus on Ethiopia. So the Egyptians were actively supporting divisive forces anti-Ethiopian forces within and outside of Ethiopia throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. So this is the post-colonial period itself represents a continuation of a very complicated, a very difficult, a very troubled relationship between Ethiopia and the downstream countries, particularly Egypt, as I said. But then there is this 1990s. The 1990s I think it probably represents a dramatic, a very significant strategic shift in the relationship between upstream and the downstream countries, and that is represented by the creation of the Nile Basin Initiative in the 1990s, in 1999. So the Nile Basin Initiative represents a kind of a watershed dividing the relationship between the two areas, the downstream and upstream areas, before and after, before 1999 and after 1999. So what this NBI represented was a period of a kind of a transition from a more unilateralist, a more monopolistic, a more zero-sum game kind of relationship when it comes to the Nile waters to a more multilateralist, a more cooperative, a more win-win kind of relationship between the countries. So this is a promise, at least. And there was a very powerful symbolism and a promise created because of the foundation of the Nile Basin Initiative. And the series of negotiations and agreements and institutional frameworks created in the period since 1999 all created the expectation that now this region, the Nile Basin region, and particularly the three areas, the three countries, now have embarked on a new phase, a new period, a new period of relationship, a new kind of cooperation, a mutually beneficial relationship. But that hasn't happened, largely because of resistance from Egypt and to some extent from Sudan to the idea of equitable and reasonable and sustainable utilization and sharing of the waters of the Nile River. So there is this desire on the part of the leadership, on the part of the political leadership, political military leadership in Egypt, in the Sudan, to perpetuate the status quo, the colonial status quo, which is anachronistic, which is legally indefensible and morally objectionable. Meaning a country that provides almost 86% of the Nile waters cannot continue to accept, it can no longer accept a claim, an Egyptian claim in this particular case for almost total, almost a complete control over the Nile River. So the situation has become even more complicated, largely because of Egyptian and Sudanese resistance, or I would say intransigence, resistance to understand the changing political landscape in the region. But that doesn't mean that there is no possibility, there is no hope. Meaning this situation, this unsustainable, unviable situation, it cannot continue. I think there is an increasing understanding in the region, including in downstream countries, that there needs to be a change. There needs to be a change when it comes to the access to the waters of the Nile River. This is partly a reflection of changing political dynamics in upstream countries, particularly Ethiopia, for instance, which is represented by a desire to use the waters of the Nile to develop the country, generate energy, and transform not just Ethiopia, but the entire region. So that's one thing. But at the same time, there is also this a regional, a global unraveling that's happening over the last 10, 20 years. And the unraveling of the region, the unraveling of the world also, has a very significant implication for what's happening in the Nile Basin, in the Nile River Basin. I think we can see these unraveling in two ways. One is the local, regional unraveling, a realignment of forces with direct implication for Ethiopia and for Ethiopia's relation with the Nile countries, other riparian countries, and particularly Egypt and the Sudan. And then we have also a global realignment of forces that has created strategic openings that Ethiopia can utilize to its own benefit, and especially when it comes to the Nile River. On the one hand, Ethiopia, there is this, especially over the last few years, there is this development in which is the rise of a kind of the revival of a more confident country, Ethiopia, a country that has become a major power, a strategic linchpin, economic security linchpin in the entire region of the Horn of Africa. And this emergence or re-emergence of Ethiopia as a significant power in the Horn of Africa is connected or rooted in significant transformative political economic developments in Ethiopia. Economically, for instance, Ethiopia has become a country that has registered significant double-digit growth over the last 15, 20 years. This is also a country with the second highest population, meaning the next to Nigeria. Ethiopia is the second most populous country in the entire region. So there is a country that is rising, that is occupying a very significant place in the region. And that ascendancy of Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa is also connected to its strategic location. And that is a location between two major water systems. One is the Nile River, and which is also connected with the construction of the GERD, the Great Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, which, when completed, would significantly transform Ethiopia's development potential, but also Ethiopia's political strategic clout in the entire Nile River basin, but also in the Red Sea region. And then you have the Red Sea on the other end. The Red Sea, which has always been a major waterway connecting Asia with Europe. And almost more than 20% of the global energy and the global trade passes through. Almost $700 billion trade passes through the Red Sea. So that location, this critical strategic location between the Nile River on the one end and the Red Sea on the other, has given Ethiopia a very significant strategic clout in the region, but also in the eyes of the international community, particularly the Arab countries, China, and the US. So that's one important realignment that we are witnessing in the region recently over the last few years. And the other is the rise of a powerful regional bloc. So there is also the potential. We have seen the potential of a regional bloc emerging in the Horn of Africa. Not just a powerful Ethiopia, but also an Ethiopian-led regional bloc that would comprise other riparian countries, and particularly Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti. These are traditional neighbors of Ethiopia, but potentially extending to upstream countries. So there is this possibility or the potential of an emerging regional bloc in the Horn of Africa that could redefine the relations in the region, but also between the region and the rest of the world. So that's one thing. That's very, very important. And this is happening within this region of Africa, the Horn of Africa, a very critical part of the world. But at the same time, there's also a realignment on a global scale. And that realignment is represented by many significant developments over the last few years. One, for instance, is, and with direct implication for the Horn of Africa, for Ethiopia and other riparian countries, is the arrival of new countries, new powerful countries in the region, like the Russians, the Turks, and the Arabs, like the Emiratis and the Saudis, but more importantly, the Chinese. So I would give considerable importance to the Chinese factor, which is redefining relations on a global scale, but also with implication for the region, and particularly for Ethiopia's relation with other riparian countries like Egypt, but also with other areas in the international community. So there is this strategic rivalry between China on the one end, and then you have the US on the other. And both of these countries, both China and the US, have a vested strategic interest in the Horn of Africa, and particularly on Ethiopia for a number of reasons, for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, in terms of its significant power, clout in the Horn of Africa, and because of its strategic location between the Red Sea and the Nile River, and because of its massive development projects over the last few years, and specifically the construction of the Great Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, which is a major development project, but a development implications for Ethiopia, for riparian countries, but also for the region, the Red Sea region. So the question now is, how should Ethiopia, because we are focusing on Ethiopia, but how should Ethiopia exploit these openings, this new realignment of forces within the region, in the Horn of Africa, but also but globally in the Red Sea region, but also in the world, especially as a result of the strategic competition between China and Africa. I think for Ethiopia, not just in connection with the construction of the Great Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, but also because of the future of the country, the very survival of Ethiopia in the future, in an area which is hugely important to the world, and particularly to the two superpowers, China and the US, and other regional powers like the Arabs, the Emiratis and the Saudis, and the Turks and the Russians, is for Ethiopia to develop a very proactive, dynamic foreign policy. So a foreign policy that has the capacity and the wisdom, the understanding to see strategic openings created in the region, in the world, and use them for the benefit of Ethiopia, but for the benefit of the region in general. I think Ethiopia's objective, strategic objective, foreign policy objective, should be the restoration of its historic and strategic place in the Horn of Africa as a major hydraulic maritime power in the region. A hydraulic maritime power. For instance, Ethiopia should predicate its foreign policy on the understanding that it is a major Red Sea country, a major Red Sea power. So the use of water, the centrality of water, whether it is the Red Sea on the one hand, or the Nile waters and the Great Ethiopia Renaissance Dam on the other, the centrality of water to Ethiopia's foreign policy objectives, Ethiopia's development objectives should be recognized. It should underpin Ethiopia's foreign policy in the future. Ethiopia also saw a hydraulic maritime power as a major energy power in the region, in the Nile Basin region. So that's one thing. So that should be the objective of Ethiopia's foreign policy. But how, and what needs to be done? What needs to be done to recover this strategic place, strengthen this strategic place in the Horn of Africa? One is, I think Ethiopia needs to examine, redefine its relations with the other riparian countries, both downstream countries, Egypt and the Sudan, but also upstream countries like Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and major sources of the Nile, the White Nile. I think Ethiopia needs to, rethink its policy vis-a-vis Egypt and the Sudan, especially in the context of Ethiopia's contemporary political and security predicament in the northern part of the country. So I think that's very, very important. But at the same time, Ethiopia also needs to revisit, rethink, but also deepen its strategic relationship, strategic partnership with countries in the Red Sea region. And here I'm referring to the Emiratis, for instance, the Arab countries, the Saudis and the Emiratis, and the Turks, broadly speaking, the Middle East. This is a region which has a very vested interest in the Horn of Africa, and specifically in the most important country in the Horn of Africa, which is Ethiopia. Ethiopia needs to have a very dynamic, very strategic relationship with these countries. And in fact, one suggestion would be, for instance, to create a strategic pact with some of the countries in the Middle East with which Ethiopia shares a strategic interests. So that's one thing. But this redefinition of Ethiopia's relation with countries in the Nile Basin, particularly downstream countries like Egypt and Sudan, but also countries in the broader Nile Red Sea region like the Emiratis or the Saudis, would not be possible or would not be effective without Ethiopia reaffirming its historic solidarity and its symbolic and practical solidarity with Africa, with the Black world, with Sub-Saharan Africa, but also with the global Black community, the global African diaspora across the world, especially across the Atlantic, with those in Europe and in the Americas. Because Ethiopia has seen time and again, especially in times of difficulties now and in the past, that its true friends, its true dependable friends are to be found in Black Africa and in the Black world. So rebuilding this historic relationship with the Black world, with the global Black diaspora is so critical to the realization of Ethiopia's foreign policy objectives. That is very, very important. As far as the GERD is concerned, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is concerned, what Ethiopia needs to do is to build on the NBI initiative. I think for an important initiative of considerable importance, strategic importance in the region is the Nile Basin Initiative. And the Nile Basin Initiative and its promise of a shared vision should be the foundation of any relationship between Ethiopia and other riparian countries, particularly downstream countries. So this idea of one river, one people, one vision, and this notion, this promise of win-win relationship, a mutually beneficial relationship, should be the basis of a new kind of partnership between Ethiopia on the one hand and other riparian countries on the other. But this will not be possible without developing a comprehensive and legally binding and probably permanent agreement involving all riparian countries and benefiting all riparian countries. That is critical. An agreement, a comprehensive, a legally binding agreement needs to be reached among all the riparian countries, because this is an agreement that will have the capacity to transform the status quo, the unsustainable, legally anachronistic, legally indefensible, morally objectionable status quo, rooted in colonial treaties of the past, of the 1929, 1959. But at the same time, this idea, this vision of a march of one river, one people, one vision, needs to develop a kind of a Marshall Plan. I think this is an idea which is suggested by many scholars before, the idea that, especially in the context of global warming and climate change that is affecting the world, and particularly Africa, including the Nile Basin, there is a need for collective investment by all riparian countries, but also by the international community on preserving the ecosystem, the Nile Basin ecosystem, and sustainable livelihoods in the region. That would be a guarantee for long-term peace and prosperity and security in Ethiopia, in the Nile Basin region, but also in the world. This is also relevant to the peace and prosperity of the broader region. But at the end, I think I would say that I think the most important factor, the most critical factor for Ethiopia's renaissance and the restoration of its place, historic place in the region, and for its capacity to play the role of being a strategic economic security energy linchpin in the region, is what's happening inside the country, internally, domestically within Ethiopia. That's why that Ethiopia needs to be rebuild a new sense of pan-Ethiopianism around these projects, for instance, like the Great Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, as a kind of a pan-Ethiopian, not just pan-African, but also a pan-Ethiopian project that can transform the country, unify the country, and rebuild the country on a foundation of unity, equality, and peace and prosperity for Ethiopia. So domestic nation building, domestic nation state building in Ethiopia, within Ethiopia, by Ethiopians, for all Ethiopians, is critical to achieving Ethiopia's foreign policy objectives, especially in connection with its two strategic resources. One, the Nile waters and the construction of the GERD, and the other is the Red Sea. I think I will end here, and I'll be happy to answer any question you might have. Thank you very much.